Hi, Henry IV, Part 1. As I said in the video on history, this was not necessarily an easy choice in terms of which history plays to study. The Henry IV, Parts 1 and 2, and Henry V, I saw one time actually blended together at the Old Globe. Right? It was like Part 1, Part 2, and Henry V all in one play, which kind of insinuates that there's a little bit of a fluff. Actually, most of the fluff is in Henry IV, Part 2. Henry V, of course, has been made into a movie with Kenneth Branagh. But Henry IV, Part 1 has certain advantages. Probably the biggest advantage is Falstaff. Falstaff has some of his most memorable appearances here in this play. I say that because if you don't know, Falstaff is a character who appears in a number of Shakespeare's plays, including the sequel. But I also wondered whether I should teach Richard II, which, as I talked about in the history video, actually initiates a lot of this action. I also saw Richard II performed with Robert Sean Leonard, if you know him from House, in the character of Richard II. So just to recap, Richard II basically is about the competence or fitness of a king. And when a king is particularly unfit to rule, the question of deposing that king, removing that king, which eventually happens when Henry Bolingbroke takes the throne away from Richard II. The title of the play, Henry IV, would insinuate that Henry Bolingbroke, Henry IV, is the most important character. In truth, I think a very good argument could be made that his son, Prince Hal, is the most important character. Because Prince Hal is a problem child. And while Henry IV, Henry Bolingbroke, usurped the throne because Richard II was an incompetent and inadequate ruler, for all intents and purposes, in much of the play, it looks like Prince Hal himself will also be an unfit king. And this worries his father immensely. Of course, part of the major action in this play is that Henry IV is opposed. His kingship is opposed by the Percys and others. Glendower, who represents the Welsh, right? Hotspur is kind of a contrast to Prince Hal. And indeed, there was a point in the play when the king, Henry IV, is very complimentary of Hotspur in connection or relationship to his own son. This is a play that is both political, dealing with a large-scale issue of the nation, but also very personal, dealing with the family. A father disappointed by his son. His son basically acting like a frat boy before there were fraternities. Actually, he's worse than that. He's hanging out with thieves. A gang of hoodlums, basically, who hang out in a tavern, predictably getting drunk, right? And robbing people. This gang is led by Falstaff. There are others. The character of Prince Hal is interesting, very, very interesting, in fact, because while he appears very dissolute in many ways, there's also a side, a Machiavellian quality to this character. Like, this is all intended, that he will rise up and meet the challenge when needed. And so this is an interesting problem, because you have royalty mixing with commoners. What does that do to the throne? What does that do to the legitimacy of the throne? After all, in Richard II, Henry Bolingbroke comments on the actions of Richard II as being essentially silly, frivolous, trivial, beneath the qualities of what a king should be. In other words, a king does not get drunk in a tavern with a bunch of boys and then hang out like highwaymen robbing passerbys. So there is this problem, right? There is this problem. So in Henry IV, you have this problem of what makes a good king, and is this good king line going to last? Is it going to last beyond one king? Because there is war. The Welsh, represented by Glendower, they want to get rid of England. Right? This is a long time away from the time when the Welsh were officially connected to England. They weren't officially connected until long after Shakespeare's time, 1707. Although Henry VIII, in the middle part of the 16th century, did pass a series of acts that did give some connection between Wales and England, called the Laws of Wales Acts, which kind of precedes this. They did other things too, though. The laws, for instance, made Welsh illegal, right? You make a language illegal. Does that sound familiar? I don't know, maybe. And so the Welsh in this story, right, are resisting the king, right? In this case, King Henry IV, right? The later Henrys, by the way, Henry VII, and therefore, of course, by extension, Henry VIII, actually have a lineage that traces back into Wales, right? But basically, it's interesting to me because in many ways in this play, the enemy, the bad guys, are in some ways attractive. See, in a standard, or let's just call it a really flat telling of a history story, you have the bad guys and the good guys, the black hats and the white hats, right? Red roses, white roses. But it reminds me a little bit, and I know this is being a little arcane, of the Iliad, where the Trojan Hector is in some ways a more sympathetic character than his arch nemesis Achilles. Achilles comes off basically as a killing machine, whereas Hector is a great warrior but also a great family man. And so Shakespeare makes Hotspur, at least on some levels, a possibly more sympathetic character. And certainly more sympathetic than the Prince Hal, who's rolling around in the tavern. Right? So you have these different levels. Right? Henry IV, who is a king but also a father. His actions of being a father are not separate from the king. Right? They, in fact, are very much part of it. But there's a family issue as well as the political issue. Right? Because Henry's already established the principle that an incompetent king should be overthrown. And while he overthrew Richard II, is his son Henry going to be the one who's next to be overthrown? That's assuming that he can, of course, fight off his own enemies, the Percys and the Welsh. Right. The character of Falstaff, we haven't even hardly talked about him, and he, of course, is one of the primary reasons why I picked this play, because I wanted us to see Falstaff in action. Falstaff is considered by critics like Harold Bloom to be one of the greatest literary creations ever. He certainly does seem to have established a kind of a type. Falstaff is cynical. On the one hand, he is this braggart, this buffoon. On the other hand, while he is called to action and to war, he is most concerned with staying alive. And issues of honor and chivalry have no place in Falstaff's world. I was mentioning watching the Old Globe put on the 3 plays, Henry IV and Henry V. John Goodman played the role of Falstaff in the production that I saw, the famous television actor and movie actor. I'm going to confess I was a little underwhelmed by his performance. I kept on thinking, there's John Goodman, there's John Goodman, not thinking there's Falstaff. Hey, he's got the body type. He seems to have the persona, but whatever. Maybe you get too famous and can't disappear into your roles anymore. But anyway, I just point that out, right? But he's a complex character, Falstaff. He's a comedic character. And I want us to think of him in many ways as a critique of the concept of chivalry and the concept of honor because of how he behaves. In one sense, he's a very modern character. He's very cynical. He's very self-serving. He doesn't believe in creeds. He doesn't believe that it's sweet and wonderful to die for one's country, because dying for one's country is simply dying. And he has no interest in that, right? So Falstaff is kind of a critique of chivalry, not just chivalry as practiced in the days of King Arthur. Chivalry may be as seen in the light of the Elizabethan world. Way, way, way after, the Middle Ages are over, of course. Right? Just a final sense about women. Where are they? What role do they play in the histories? Not much. Not much. Right? We do have Mistress Quickly bringing the beer. That's always very nice, right? But the history plays in general are very masculine plays in that particular respect. And to be honest, the more effeminate, maybe that's too strong of a word, but the more womanly-like qualities from a traditional patriarchal view a king has, right, the less we think of him, or at least Shakespeare thought of him, unless the audience thinks so. Ultimately, right, the Henry play, Henry IV Part 1 play, is a setup, right? It's the beginning of a process that leads to Prince Hal becoming Henry V, right? But this is the beginning. This is the part of that story where we see where he starts in this kind of very inappropriate character, mixing with the not just commoners but thieves, the worst of the worst, right? He's mixing with them and, quite frankly, jeopardizing the entire future of England.